Hi there, I'm State Representative Christina Minicucci, and I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about the Merrimack Valley gas explosions class action lawsuit. We have, in our office, have received so many different questions from people trying to get more clarifying information about what is a class action lawsuit, who is able to file for this class action lawsuit, and just kind of some specific questions about what types of information people need to be providing and how we can go about helping people understand the system. So while a class action lawsuit doesn't directly have anything to do with me as a state legislator, I always feel that my role is to make sure I connect my constituents with people who do know the answers and who can help. So today I've brought in John Roddy of Bailey and Glasser, and he's one of 3 of the lawyers leading the class action lawsuit here with against Columbia Gas. So here we are today with John. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on the show. So my first question that I hear from so many people, what is a class action lawsuit?
Well, in its simplest form, a class action lawsuit allows people who are in the same situation to pool their resources in order to go to court and try to get a remedy for something bad that's happened to them. Here, because an individual really wouldn't have much of a chance against a huge entity like Columbia Gas, class action is kind of the ideal vehicle to bring everybody together to get a remedy for everybody that's fair to all.
Okay, so one of the things that a lot of people ask is who is entitled to apply for this class action lawsuit?
So in the settlement, the entire class is composed of everybody who has lived on September 13th of last year, of 2018 now, owned a business or owned a property, or operated a business, I should say, in any of the 3 communities. They are all entitled to seek a remedy.
So a person who lives outside the impacted area but lives in North Andover, or Lawrence would still be entitled to file a claim?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Could you explain a little bit how we got to this point? Why is it that we were able to, that this group of people were able to go after Columbia Gas in this situation and able to get this settlement?
That's a bit of a long story, so let me try to break it up into bite-sized pieces. First, after the catastrophe, a number of people came to lawyers in Boston, where I am, and throughout the country, actually, and asked them to file a lawsuit to see if they could recover for what happened. There were ultimately a dozen class action lawsuits, or so-called mass action lawsuits, filed, and they were all consolidated in front of Judge Lang in Essex Superior Court.
Okay. And as part of that, when everybody came together, how is it that you were able to go after Columbia Gas? Why is it that they weren't paying people for their pain and suffering, I guess, as the case may be here?
So there's 2 legal obstacles to people getting money from Columbia Gas for pain and suffering. For an individual, there's a thing called a tariff. And the long story short is that when a utility like Columbia agrees to have its rates set by the state also agrees that Columbia will be insulated from liability for anything like pain and suffering that they may cause through the kind of incident that happened here.
So basically, they are forced to fix the tangible, I believe you call them, tangible damages that they make in the community, but they are not required by law to pay people for the intangible damages.
That's right. So sometimes the way we try to explain it to people is if Columbia Gas breaks something, for example, the boiler in your house, they have to fix it, and they have to take care of all of the repairs and the new appliances and other things that were broken by their misconduct. But if you were displaced and you were upset or your kids were traumatized, those are things that follow from the breakage, and those kinds of things, Columbia Gas is insulated from them. They're called incidental and consequential damages under the law. So Columbia Gas is not liable for those kinds of damages.
So the reason why this class action lawsuit came about was so that people could seek these damages or reimbursement for their pain and suffering.
Yes, the class action lawsuit really focuses on those intangibles that you talked about. So for example, if I come to you in the middle of the night and I say, okay, you have to leave the house with your kids and I'm going to bring you to a motel in Seabrook, New Hampshire, and you're going to stay there for a month because there's something wrong with what we did, what's the compensation for that? How do you recover? There are no clear answers to that. Columbia Gas's legal defense would be tariff precludes anything.
Mm-hmm. So they really got off easy in a lot of situations here because they didn't have to pay for so much of people's pain and suffering at all.
Well, one of the things that is interesting about this settlement is that Columbia Gas was required to pay a lot of money for what they broke. Mm-hmm. As far as we know, that is to date at least $1.38 billion that went to the three communities for repair, restructuring, and restoration. Mm-hmm. The settlement is the money that we obtained through negotiating with them on top of the $1.38 billion, and it's designed to give money to people for those so-called intangible harms.
Right. Now, I've heard from a lot of people that they feel like they're shortchanged, like Columbia Gas isn't paying enough, that this settlement wasn't high enough. Can you explain how the settlement process comes about and maybe some experiences you've had in other places in similar situations and what the alternative to this settlement might look like?
Sure. Well, for background in terms of how we got here, there are two cases that I've been involved in the last 2 decades. Most recently, the Volkswagen diesel cheating scandal, where we were one of 20 firms on a committee appointed by the judge that basically was designated to negotiate with Volkswagen to resolve the scandal and to get as much money to the people affected as soon as possible. So we were able to go directly to the bargaining table with Volkswagen. Mm-hmm. 20 years ago, we did the same thing with Sears, when Sears was engaged in a nationwide scheme to deprive people of rights under the bankruptcy code. We went directly to the bargaining table, and in both those cases, we were able to, within about the same period of time, roughly a year from the incident, reach a settlement for an entire class of people. Now, the other two are obviously nationwide cases, mm-hmm. and bigger than this case, but here, the class is still roughly 175,000 people and businesses.
Okay. And if you weren't able to settle this immediately, what would happen if you went to court? And do you have other examples of what happens when one of these lawsuits actually goes to court and you actually try to litigate in the court? I guess, am I using the words correctly?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
What happens in that kind of scenario?
Well, in practical terms, no one on either side ever really knows for certain what's going to happen when you go to court. Yeah. All of us who are involved in this have won cases that we should have lost, mm-hmm. but we've also lost cases we should have won. A good example for this case is that of the other 2 lawyers who are working with me on leadership, one of them has a very similar case in California. It's called Porter Ranch. It was a gas leak. A neighborhood had to be evacuated. There were toxins in the air, and PG&E, the power company in California, did not want to settle, and they went to court, and the plaintiffs in that class action lost on the business side because of an economic loss doctrine, which basically is like the business equivalent of the tariff as applied mm-hmm. to individuals. So after 4 years and millions of dollars of time and expenses, that entire community of businesses got 0.
Right. So this settlement, while it may not be as much as people would like to see, because when you talk to people in this community, you know how deeply hurt people were by this, not necessarily physically, but definitely emotionally hurt. It was really a tough year for people, a lot of people not even being back in their homes by Thanksgiving of last year, which was hard. They lost a whole holiday season. And people believe that they are rightfully owed more So, this has been a very, very difficult situation for people. And so can you explain a little bit, how is it that people are going to be compensated through this class action program?
Sure. Although I have to say I have understood more and more as this progressed what you've been talking about, because I have heard dozens of heartbreaking stories, people who went through horrible circumstances and are still trying to recover. So I do understand, to the extent I can, just from listening to people, what it was like for them to go through that and to still be dealing with it. So the idea behind our settlement is that we want to make sure that everybody who is affected gets as much money as possible based on the severity of the impact on their lives. So whether it's an individual or it's a business, we've designed the settlement so that people can explain on the claims form how this has affected them, and then we will compare everybody's situation and treat everybody in the same way, which is to say as fairly as possible in relation to their neighbor or a competing business, so that everyone gets the same amount of money from the pool of money.
Okay. And I know that so many people have been intimidated by the form. They get worried, where's my information going, and how do I fill this out? It's a lot of, not that it's complicated legalese, but certainly there's terminology in there about making sure that they're not lying on the form, and people have a lot of nervousness of, what if my date is off by a couple days when my gas was restored? What if I was out of my house for fewer days than I wrote on there? Is someone going to come after me? Am I going to be in trouble? So can you explain a little bit how, when people fill this form out, what types of information really need to be captured before that January 31st deadline?
Sure. And I'm glad you mentioned the deadline, because I know it's human nature, and I'm subject to it as well, to think, oh, the form's kind of a pain in the butt. I'll fill it out next week. If you do fill it out, you will get compensation, assuming the settlement's approved. And if you don't, then once the deadline passes, we really can't do anything about it, because we can't treat anyone in the class differently from anyone else in the class. Okay. The form's a necessary evil, because in order to give the people who are most severely impacted the most money, we need to be able to look at their situation. So someone who perhaps lives on the periphery of North Andover and who heard about this on the news but was otherwise unaffected, they can get some money, but really the idea is that the people who are in the middle of the catastrophe will get the most money, and that money will be determined based on the length of time they were evacuated, the severity of the disruption, how old they are, how many kids they have, how far they had to travel. All of those factors, in order to treat people fairly, we need to know, and that's the reason that we have the necessary evil of the form.
Right. Now, let's talk a little bit about outstanding claims. There are still people who have some outstanding claims pending with Columbia Gas. How will that be handled?
It's actually handled in two different ways, depending on how the person wants to approach it. For the lump sum form, even if somebody's already received compensation from Columbia Gas, although presumably not 100% of the compensation they believe they're entitled to, if they fill out the lump sum form, they can get as much as $15,000 without the money they've already gotten being taken into account. But if somebody has, let's say, more extensive injuries or harm, and they've been paid $70,000 by Columbia Gas, but they should have been paid $100,000, then hopefully we'll be able to get them the additional $30,000 from the settlement. If that person's neighbor in an identical situation has suffered $100,000 worth of losses, but Columbia Gas didn't pay them anything, then they should get $100,000. So both people are treated the same way.
Right.
They both ended up with $100,000. So if someone has gotten money from Columbia Gas, that will be counted to determine how much they get in total, as opposed to somebody else who's in the same situation who may not have gotten that same amount of money.
So when talking about the form, there is some language on there talking about if you certify that it's to the best of your ability. I'm paraphrasing, but that pains and penalties of perjury. People have a lot of fear that if all the information they input was exactly correct, that somehow their claim will be dismissed. Is that the case?
No, not at all. So two things. One is that the reason that there's a certification that what you're putting down is true is that it's an unfortunate fact of life that people will try to cash in on catastrophes. And so you could have somebody from Arkansas filling out a form saying, oh, I lived on Main Street in South Lawrence during the catastrophe. So we need to be able to randomly check, and when I say we, it's Heffler, the claims administrator that we've hired because this is all they do. This is their business and they know how to operate these things. So we just check to make sure that people are who they say they are and that they lived in the area on September 13th. And if there's a slight mistake, like I put down, oh, my gas came back on December 11th, but in reality it was turned back on December 1st, that really doesn't matter. We're just asking people to give us a general ballpark. And it will all be put into the mix and nobody's going to be disqualified. The only reason you're disqualified is if you're not really entitled to money.
Right.
That is to say, you're not a member of the class.
People who are lying.
Yes, exactly.
Very specifically being fraudulent.
Right.
And what qualifies, you were talking about, proving residency on September 13th, 2018. What qualifies as proper documentation for that?
Pretty much anything that you could reasonably look at to say, okay, this makes sense. Let's say that I live with 3 roommates and, we're all 25-year-old guys. Well, one of them may be on the electric bill, but not all 3 of us would be. Mm-hmm. So something else that shows that's where I was living on September 13th, or even a letter from your landlord saying, yeah, John Roddy is one of 3 roommates here. Okay. We're not really looking for something that is a legal document. We're just looking for something that shows that you're entitled to compensation because you were in the middle of it on September 13th.
Okay. Now, when people fill this form out, it asks for a lot of questions, and maybe you have a specific story to tell, you have an outstanding claim with a whole bunch of backup documentation that you've already given to Columbia Gas. When you talk to people around the community, they'll tell you, I have submitted the same paperwork 5 times, I don't want to do it again. Will they have to submit this documentation yet another time?
No, and just to back up for a second, there's been some confusion in people that I've spoken with as to exactly who's running the show here. Now, Columbia Gas did have a claims process, and people submitted lots of documents to Columbia Gas right up through the end of August of 2018. But then when we settled the case, it came under the supervision of the court. Columbia's claims process was stopped, and we hired the claims administrator, the professional claims administrator, Heffler, to make sure that everybody was treated fairly and that everybody had a chance to make a claim. So by Heffler taking over the claims process, they were given access to all the documents that people had submitted to Columbia. People can still submit more documents if they want, but they don't have to go back and reinvent the wheel.
Okay. And so if someone submitted documents to Columbia Gas and they rejected that claim, they would have the ability to resubmit now. Maybe it would still get rejected as not counting, but they would have the ability to resubmit things that were previously rejected by Columbia Gas.
They absolutely would. And there's a different calculus that Heffler uses versus what Columbia Gas did. For example, if we go back to our earlier discussion about the tariff and the economic loss doctrine, Worley Services may have looked at somebody who had a claim that was barred by the tariff and say, we reject it. Mm-hmm. That's going to be the opposite. The opposite result will happen with Heffler. They'll say, you're entitled to money. It's just a question of how much we can give you in order to make sure that we treat you as fairly as the next person in line who's in the same situation.
Okay. So this isn't going to be a flat fee for every person who lives in the impacted zone. Each family is going to be given a different amount based on their specific situation. So it'll be anybody who has that specific situation across the impacted zone will get paid evenly and fairly.
Yes, that's right.
That makes sense.
In fact, it's, from our point of view, it would be extremely unfair to just hand out a flat lump sum payment to everybody, because you may be on the opposite side of the street from me and may have suffered the destruction of your house, and you may have been out of your house for 4 months. And I, even though I only live 100 yards away, may have only been out for 3 days and my gas was turned back on. Mm-hmm. So you and I should be treated completely differently. And that's the way that the settlement's designed. You'll get much more money than I will, although both of us are entitled to compensation regardless, because we were in the middle of the incident.
Right. So I would be compensated the same way as other people all across this district who experienced what I experienced.
Yes. It's hard to describe, but essentially there are a number of factors that would determine how severely your life was disrupted. People whose lives were most severely disrupted will get the most money, and we go down the scale to people who were, as we were talking about before, maybe just reading about it or seeing it on the news that night.
Right. Now, I have explored the claims process and gone through the online form, and I did notice that if you click on itemized claim, you have the ability to write a story. And is that the location, or you could upload a story, I believe. So is that what, where you would encourage people to tell their specific story?
Yes. So, for example, what we were just discussing, you were severely impacted and I was barely touched. I don't really have a story. I was out of my house for 3 days and I can get some money. You went through an awful lot. So in order to treat you as fairly as possible, would like to know what your story is. And when we say we want documents, if you don't have a document that says, this is my story, then write it up. Send in a narrative and say, this is how I was extraordinarily affected. And again, Heffler will go through all of those and look at people who are in the same situation and make a compensation judgment accordingly.
Now, if someone has already filled out their form and they said, I'm not going to itemize, that sounds too complicated, I'm just going to check off the basics, how long they were out of their home, how long they didn't have gas. But now they say, gee, I really wish I didn't know I could do this. Can they still add the story?
Absolutely. People can supplement their claims all the way through the deadline of January 31st. And there's an 800 number where you can call a Heffler claims representative to get help if you're not exactly sure how to do that. And there are also 2 more town halls that we will be holding with more than a dozen people who are trained to help others fill out their claim forms. And they'll be January 18th and January 25th, Saturday from noon to 5 on the 18th. Stops at 2:30 actually on the 25th at Lawrence Voc Tech High School.
Okay, great. And then you also have an office in Andover, and what are the hours of that office?
Well, so that office is at 300 Brickstone Square, and the hours are 9 to 5, Monday through Thursday, and it closes at 2:30 on Friday. There are Heffler claims representatives there on site for the entire duration, and they are there specifically just to help people fill out their claims.
Okay. And what happens for people who have additional questions and maybe can't make it during work hours? Is that 800 number, does that have extended hours, or are the weekends
The 800 number has extended hours, and anybody who is unable to get to the town halls on the weekend or to get to the Andover office during the week can feel free to call the 800 number or to call one of the local community groups that is helping. Ernie Cintron is in charge, and E. Paratolos, I believe, is the name of his organization.
E. Paratolos.
Yes. And
they speak Spanish.
and we do also have Spanish speakers available both at the Heffler office and at the town halls.
Okay, great. I know that that's a big question for a lot of people, is whether or not they can access the forums. And I know many of some of our elderly community members do not use, we're a little intimidated by some of the internet forums, and they're not when you're 25, you always put your private information in the internet and you trust the world. But, even my age, I'm not as happy about putting my private information into forms. So people do have the ability to do this by hand too on paper,
Yes,
correct?
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And I think sort of one of my closing questions, something that we haven't really discussed, but what is the difference between Heffler and Worley? A lot of people believe that this class action lawsuit is Columbia Gas. What is the difference between these two organizations? And
there is, or there was, and there still remains some confusion about how we transitioned from Columbia Gas and its claims company, Worley Services, to Heffler. And I guess the easiest way to describe it is Worley was hired by Columbia Gas, and their job was to basically serve Columbia Gas's interests. It doesn't mean they would treat people unfairly. It just means that if Columbia Gas had the choice to spend money or not spend money, and they had a legal defense like the tariff, then Worley was less likely to say, okay. The flip side is Heffler, who works for us and is in charge of giving money to people, is essentially given the mission of making sure people get as much money as possible, but to make sure that everybody who gets that money is treated as fairly as possible within the scope of their particular situation.
so the difference really is Heffler is working for the people. The people are their client versus Worley, Columbia Gas was their client. And
Yes.
they're not the same thing. They're completely separate.
That's
And
a good way to
I
put
know
it.
that has been a very big source of confusion for a lot of people. So thank you for clarifying that. And I guess, what is your number one piece of advice for people? Why is it imperative that they apply by January 31st? What is the number one thing, I guess, you'd like people to go away knowing today?
Well, people should know that if they file a claim form, if they're within the class area, they are entitled to compensation. And because there's a deadline of January 31st, if for whatever reason they fail to file by that date, we can't really do anything about that because this is overseen by the court. The court set that deadline. And in terms of treating people fairly, if you submitted your claim on January 15th and I submitted mine on February 15th and said, oh, I was really busy, it wouldn't be fair to you for me to get money even though I didn't get my claim form in on time. The major issue here is that people can get the money that is most fairly allocated to them based on how much they were hurt by the catastrophe. So I'd encourage everybody to submit a claim form.
Okay. And there won't be any pulling of strings happening after the fact. January 31st is it. There's no special dispensation for anybody after that date.
That's right. And the other thing that people should understand is that of the $143 million, none of that will go back to Columbia Gas. It will all be spent to pay people's claims and the expenses of the case. So the more people that file claims, the more people that will get money. And everyone has the choice to do what they want, but especially for those who are most affected in the middle of the maelstrom when this thing happened, there are significant amounts of money. For some people, it would be life-changing. So I would encourage everybody not to pass up the opportunity.
And I know that a lot of people who maybe feel like this isn't sufficient money for them, and they are holding out thinking that the courts might overturn this and that this is not going to go through and it's not going to be approved. And can you just explain what that last sort of step of the process would be?
Sure. In a class action, once a settlement is proposed, notice goes out and everybody can make a claim. And then it goes back to the court and the judge makes a final decision whether the class action settlement is fair and reasonable. That will be heard before the judge on February 27th. Now, if the judge approves it, then the money should go out within the next 60 days. If for whatever reason the judge denies the case, the settlement, or if somebody who objects appeals, then there will be a delay, usually of years. And if we go back to court, Then we'll probably have those issues to overcome that I described earlier, whether the tariff precludes all of these claims, whether the economic loss doctrine prevents businesses from recovering anything in a class action. So there are significant legal obstacles, and more importantly, if the community at large were to get a large infusion of cash, $143 million, all at once, that has a ripple effect on the economy and on the community as a whole that's very beneficial. But again, it all rests in the hands of the judge.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, John, for joining us here today and giving us lots of good information. What's the best way, just in wrapping up, for people to contact you guys?
The easiest way to contact us is through Heffler. Their information is on the website, columbiagasexplosionsettlement.com. The 800 number is also on the website. And if anybody has any particular concerns or questions, they could certainly go through your office and you could put them in touch with us directly.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John, for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon. That was John Roddy from Bailey and Glasser. He is one of the attorneys working on the Columbia Gas Merrimack Valley Explosions class action lawsuit. And thank you for joining us today. If there are any additional topics that you'd like to have us discuss on future shows, please feel free to reach out to my office. I'd be happy to hear from you, or any guests that you'd like to see join us. Also, anytime you have any questions, if you want to meet with me personally, have any issues regarding legislation, help in the community, getting the services that you need, you can always reach out to our office, and we're always happy to help you. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.